Welcome to this special presentation of the 2020 Annual Ethics and Compliance Training. And it's always important, as I do every year, to emphasize that this isn't just a compliance meeting. This is also an ethics meetings because compliance alone is not enough. And we always must continue to be vigilant about our ethical responsibilities and staying true to those core ethical values like integrity, trustworthiness, respect, and responsibility. And at the end of the day, it's really about one question, and that question is, are we doing what's right for the client, or are we doing what's right for the organization? And when you look at our mission and values and how we behave, included along with passion for progress and passion to serve others, is a passion to do right. And that really rings true for us in our ethics and compliance program. So I know we're in some crazy times, and but we always do like to keep to some traditions. And of course, a tradition of our annual compliance get together. And while we only get to do this on an annual basis, I know you think about it on a daily basis, but it's exciting to be back and keep this tradition alive, even though in a little bit of a different form. We originally had thought we might take a trip. You know, usually we'll get out to visit our different offices live, and sometimes we go on a compliance tour. We did our meeting in San Jose one year. So this year, I guess we're going to have to stay virtual, Jake.
Wait, so we're not going to Hawaii for this year's training?
Ooh, Anderson told me we had a tight budget this year.
This is awkward. So I guess we'll have to pivot to a different idea. So again, as Sal previewed, uncharacteristic and crazy times right now, and our compliance team gave some thought about what to do for training. Again, we always like getting out and doing fun ideas and getting others incorporated into training. And so being stuck from a work from home environment, and personally, I know our team and a lot of other teams missed out on a lot of the trips they took this year, right? Whether it was traveling to see family or friends or take vacations. And so for this year's training, we thought it'd be fun to do a theme of taking a road trip, a virtual road trip with our compliance team to see different sights and sounds throughout the country and try to pull that together to sort of relate different compliance and ethics concepts throughout the training. And so grab some snacks, pack a bag. I know I've got my stuff here. We're ready for our road trip.
Now that we're all packed up for our road trip, let's take a look at our roadmap. Our first stop will be covering the fiduciary duty. Next, we'll talk about our culture of compliance and some regulatory updates. We'll then review our code of ethics. We'll then take a quick pit stop and move on to part 2 of our training, where we'll go over some primary compliance risk areas. We'll then wrap up with a review of cybersecurity risk as well as social media. We're now approaching our first stop on our road trip today.
And that is the Museum of Fiduciary Duty. So despite COVID, the museum is actually still open. So I was lucky enough to get us some limited viewing on reservation only. So I got us a time slot for our team to walk through the museum and see some of the sites. But the only tough part here is that they actually don't have any working tour guides to help explain and talk about some of the exhibits. So we're kind of left in this tough spot of wanting to see and walk through, but not knowing that much about the exhibit. Sal, any ideas here?
Jake, I could give it a shot. I think I could give it a shot to
Great.
give the
Well,
tour.
let's see if Sal can walk us through the Museum of Fiduciary Duty here. I do want to remind our team, please keep your cell phones either off or silent during this part of the tour. Again, we want to respect the great history and the great legacy of the Museum of Fiduciary Duty. So with that, Sal, let's walk through the museum and start our tour.
Great. Thanks, Jake. And I'm going to keep a lower voice so as to not disturb the other viewing people as well as this spectacular art. I'm really excited that this is the first visit along our journey because this really is my favorite museum. And why it is our first stop is that it's the first principle of a registered investment advisor, of course, which is fiduciary duty. And as we walk through the museum, I'm going to highlight a couple of different pieces within the museum. And there really is a wide variety of art within this museum. It ranges from sort of that abstract art, which is where the legislative history of fiduciary duty came into play under the Investment Advisors Act of 1940. And we transition further over and we get into some impressionism art where we had some famous paintings from the Supreme Court cases talking about fiduciary duty, including SEC versus Capital Gains Research Bureau in 1963. Look at the history there. It's pretty spectacular. And we go all the way over to some current or new art, what I'll call pop art, which is we just in 2019 had a release as part of a package of new interpretive guidance and rules from the SEC, including Reg BI and Form CRS. We actually had a commission interpretation regarding standards of conduct for investment advisors, which talks all about fiduciary duty. This is amazing. This museum is dynamic and spectacular. I'm so excited to bring you through it. Jake, let's start or make a first stop, and actually I'm going to highlight some key fiduciary duty concepts. So why don't we go ahead to our first one, and that is the duty of care. And the duty of care is such an important one because at the end of the day, an advisor owes a duty of care to their clients, which means that an advisor at all times must serve the best interests of the clients based on the client's objectives. And within that, it includes, but isn't limited to, of course, those obligations to provide advice that's in the client's best interest. It has an obligation to seek best execution and an obligation to act and provide advice and monitoring over the course of that client relationship. And this fiduciary duty applies upon the opening of an account and to all investment advice that's provided. And this particular duty of care is really essential to our fiduciary obligations. So moving through the museum here, going a little bit through some realism art and some more surrealism art as well, we get to our next fiduciary duty highlight that we want to talk about. And that is the duty of loyalty. This piece here is, again, this is when we think about the Statue of David, when we think about the Mona Lisa, these pieces that are just so important in our history. This is another one. This is duty of loyalty. And duty of loyalty, when we think about duty of loyalty, some of the highlights that we think about here are that the fact that an advisor cannot subordinate its interest or its associate's interest to a client's interest, right? And we must always act in that client's interest. And the SEC interprets this duty of loyalty to require an advisor to eliminate or make full and fair disclosure of all conflicts of interest, which might incline an advisor consciously or unconsciously to render advice which is not disinterested, such that a client can provide informed consent to that conflict. And a key highlight here is full and fair disclosure. And while we certainly seek to eliminate a large portion of conflicts of interest for us, there are conflicts that just exist and are inherent within our business that we must address. And so for those conflicts that we cannot avoid, we must make full and fair disclosure of those material conflicts of interest. We also have to ensure that we adopt policies and procedures to address those things. So I figured those would be some wonderful pieces to highlight, Jake. I know we have limited time on our road trip, but I'm so excited that our first stop was this fiduciary museum because it really is such an important museum. And it really is the first principle of a registered advisor. So don't forget, put clients' interests first, act with good faith, provide full and fair disclosure, don't mislead, and expose all conflicts of interest. So Jake, thanks for letting me take this team on this tour and take everybody on this tour with us. It really was a special moment.
Thank you for walking through that, Sal. And, would have figured you had years of experience walking through the museum based on those scripted, nice guidance you just gave us. So,
well, I have to be honest, Jake. It was not my first trip to this museum. I have visited on a regular basis, and I actually have a membership. I think it's a lifetime membership to this museum.
I would hope so, yes.
So luckily, our next stop on our trip is actually just outside of the museum, and that is the 5 pillars of Buckingham's compliance program. The Statue of Liberty, the Gateway Arch, Mount Rushmore, all some of our nation's top national parks and monuments. But those all pale in comparison to our second stop on our trip today, the 5 pillars of Buckingham's compliance program. We came up with these pillars about 3 years ago when we were trying to think of our elevator pitch of how we would describe our compliance program if we had 90 seconds. And so we came up with these 5 pillars. And it's important to think about the pillars from left to right. We've brought these pillars into our training the last few years and continue to do so because we think it's a really great way to describe our culture of compliance across the firm. Starting with our people. We hire the right people. We trust our people. We need our people to be frontline defense. We only have 7 compliance team members, but we think of everyone around the firm as an extension of our compliance team in solving risk. Next is our culture. It's not just a culture of compliance, it's the firm's culture. I think we've got great combination of culture both in Legacy Loring Ward and with Buckingham. Bringing those items together and uniting with people who have a shared sense of culture and what's important to them is really important to the firm and to our compliance program. Controls. Compliance is a policy and control-based function. Because of that, we need to have certain restrictions, certain rules, certain regulations that we need to follow, which is why we have documents like our code of ethics, our policies and procedures, all things that we can point to make sure we have a control in place. Next is training. Doing training sessions like this, trying to be as proactive as possible to make sure if and when possible, we can mitigate risk by getting ahead of it and training our associates to identify that risk. And then lastly is testing. This concept of trusting but verifying it is one you'll hear a lot in compliance. We do a ton of monthly, quarterly, and annual tests to make sure that whether it's from client data to personal securities transactions reporting to email review, that we're satisfying all of our regulatory requirements. So when we think about how these 5 pillars relate to the values of the firm, we think layering these core values over our pillars is essentially the cherry on top when we think about our culture of compliance, right? This idea of having a passion to serve, to do what's right for our clients, and a passion to progress. All 3 things that really can tie back to the work we do in compliance. We need to do right. We need to have controls and to test and to train. We strive to serve, right? We partner with the right people, the right custodian partners, the right vendors, and build that culture of compliance. And we have a like-mindedness in terms of everyone wants to progress. Our organization is always looking to excel and to grow. And so we need that progress to push us forward, not only across the firm, but within our compliance department as well. As we leave the 5 pillars and get back on the road, we will now talk about some of the main regulatory developments from 2020. The first of which was the Form CRS. The Form CRS, abbreviated as Client Relationship Summary, also known as Form ADV Part 3, was filed in June and delivered to clients in July. The firm filed separate versions for Buckingham Strategic Wealth and Buckingham Strategic Partners, and again satisfied the delivery requirements to the required clients in July. It's important to note that we tried to be as proactive as possible, both in the training we rolled out to advisory personnel and client service team members, in addition to the workflows that we integrated into the ethos around the firm. All of that was an effort to, again, try to get ahead of possible questions, whether that was, again, questions from the CRS document itself. There's an FAQ section where we, again, had pre-scripted answers and guides to help advisors answer the questions related to Form CRS. And also, we tried to build into our Salesforce instance and provide guidance as best as possible to advisors on the delivery requirements of the form itself. And so we satisfied that original one in July, but there are ongoing delivery requirements to the document that need to be adhered to. Some of which, and again, we've sort of built these in, but anytime someone requests the form, within 30 days of a client converting from a prospect to an actual client, anytime that we may roll over assets from an existing account. Again, we took all of these factors in the rule for the Form CRS and built those into triggering events in Salesforce to kick off an automated email. And, jury's still out on the rule itself and how this is helping inform and educate end investors in a more succinct way from besides a 20 to 25 page Form ADV Part 2. But we've seen minimal questions about the document, which we see as a good sign. And our team really, again, kudos to our advisors and our operations and client service teams for helping us a lot to solidify this work related to the CRS to make sure we were in a great spot once the rule was final. And so CRS was a landmark rule in 2020. The other item we wanted to mention is the California Consumer Privacy Act. And so for an update on that rule, I'm going to kick it over to Amanda Robinson. Amanda?
As many of you know from last year's compliance training, the California Consumer Privacy Act went into effect on January 1st, 2020. This law gives certain rights and obligations to California residents. Enforcement of the law began in July of this year, and the Attorney General of California has also finalized the Attorney General guidelines. A few items to note: the California Privacy Rights Act, CPRA, or as I like to call it, CCPA 2.0, was on the ballot this year. Many of our California associates may have received the giant packet of information regarding the proposed law ahead of time. If passed, this law will give further rights and protections to California residents, including the rights of California employees and the sharing of information between businesses. Because of this enactment, we have updated our privacy policy and added a supplemental California privacy notice. In preparation for the enactment of the CCPA, and in order to gain a better understanding of how Buckingham maintains and collects personal information, the compliance team, in partnership with Extero, launched a data inventory project. The results from this exercise helped us understand current practices related to records and information management. This tool also helped our compliance team gain a better understanding of what, how, when, and where information across the firm is collected. It also allowed us to identify areas in which we can improve on in our record retention controls.
Thanks, Amanda, for that overview of the CCPA. We're going to next pivot to our Code of Ethics. As we previewed earlier in the training, we are not just going to cover compliance topics today, but also go through ethics. When we think about defining ethics, it's oftentimes difficult to try to explain or to try to define, and easier to identify rather in action. When someone is not acting in an ethical manner, or when something just doesn't seem right, it's a lot easier to spot. And so we have both the abstract and some tangible examples of ethics on the screen to get all of our associates thinking about what ethics means, right? This concept of a set of moral principles or values, where you'll often see principles, standards of conduct, again, these sort of buzzwords throughout the industry. But we also have some clear, tangible examples. Our code of ethics, our privacy and confidentiality policies. For those of you who are member groups of the CFA or CFP board, clear code of ethics and standards in those groups as well, in addition to the securities law that govern us as an investment advisor firm. But oftentimes it's easier to, again, try to think of examples or cases of what ethics could mean. And when I was thinking about our ethics program, and in particular our code of ethics and our road trip theme today, I thought about a roundabout as a good example of what ethics means. This concept of promoting continuous flow of traffic, right? It's one-way traffic. Comparing that to our code, it's a clear, defined code of ethics that helps everyone move in the same direction. Roundabouts are meant to reduce accidents and delays in traffic, and our code is meant to reduce violations. In a roundabout, there is a clear understanding of what is right or wrong. Drivers know when they should and should not merge into traffic. When we think about ethics, most folks know what's right and what's wrong. And then lastly, and I thought this was a fun comparison here, especially in a work from home and an emergency environment, roundabouts still are effective during a power outage. One of the big benefits you'll see, right? So we don't need traffic signals. Ethics is still effective when no one is watching, when the power's out, when we're working from home. So comparing that to our code of ethics document itself, on the screen here, you'll see our code roundabout. In the center of the screen, it's first and foremost our standards of conduct and fiduciary duty. We list that at the start of our code of ethics, and it's a great foundation of where we stand as a firm, placing the client's interest ahead of our own, duty of loyalty to clients, avoiding any type of non-reasonable compensation, all things that are the foundation and the bedrock of our code of ethics and our morals and our standards as a firm as well. But we also have these other factors, which Hung and Amanda are going to go over next, that are the outsides of our roundabout of our code of ethics. Things like gifts and entertainment reporting, trading protocols, confidentiality provisions. Everything flows together to make one solid, unified code of ethics. So again, hopefully that explanation and thinking a little outside of the box about code and comparing it, again, in our car road trip here to a roundabout, gives you a clear understanding of what we're trying to portray here when we think about ethics. So Hung, do you want to go over next and start with some gifts and entertainment requirements?
Thank you, Jake. Now we'll move over to the gifts and entertainment requirement. So there are limits to gift giving and gift receiving for all employees, and your limits will depend on whether or not you are registered as a representative of Foreside. Annually, you can give up to $350 per person per year, or receive $350 per person per year if you are not registered. If you are registered, then that limit goes down to $100 per person. Any gifts that you receive will need to be reported on Schwab CT, and any gifts that you want to give will also need to be pre-cleared through Schwab CT before you can give the gift. So you can do this by going to your dashboard in Schwab CT and creating a gift request. That will allow you to either put in a gift received or a gift you're intending on giving. For entertainment, there's no dollar limit set, but any entertainment event must remain reasonable. So this unfortunately means no yacht cruises or VIP backstage passes to see Beyonce. In order for an event to be considered a gift, both the recipient and the receiver must be at the event. If you're giving or receiving tickets to an event, but both parties won't be there, this would be considered a gift that you would need to report instead. Any securities accounts also need to be reported to compliance and logged in Schwab CT. If you have a new securities account, you need to get pre-approval from compliance and Foreside prior to opening the new brokerage account. So this can be done through Schwab CT by going to the form section and doing a securities account pre-approval. After the account has been approved through Schwab CT, then you will need to go back into Schwab CT, into your dashboard, to My Brokerage Accounts, and add these accounts as a new account. To help determine whether or not you need to report a securities account and how you should enter the securities account in Schwab CT, you can use the chart here. So if the account holds any ETFs, closed-end funds, or individual equities, then it will likely need to be reported. Any accounts that you would like to open need to also be able to have transactions captured as an electronic feed in Schwab CT. The easiest brokerage firms that you can do this through are Schwab, Fidelity, TD, E-Trade, and Vanguard. If you will be doing any trading in Focus Stock, the SA funds, or any IPOs, limited offers, hot issues, or private placements, you'll also need to pre-clear this through Schwab CT. You can do this by creating a pre-clearance under the Quick Link section. Outside business activities also need to be pre-cleared before you can start them. This can be done in Schwab CT under Forms. An OBA needs to be reported when it is investment-related, even if there is no compensation, such as being a board member or a volunteer for an investment-related organization. An OBA also needs to be reported when it is not investment-related, but there is compensation, such as working at a family business or having an online store like Etsy or eBay. If you're not sure if you need to report it, then it's always better to disclose. This way, we can decide if it needs to be captured in Schwab CT or not. And now I'll turn it over to Amanda to go over some additional pre-clearance requirements.
In August of this year, the Compliance Department updated the firm's Code of Ethics specifically pertaining to political contributions. Buckingham does not currently provide advisory services to governmental entity clients, which inherently lowers the risk in this area. These changes to the political contribution process will reduce some of the pre-clearance obligations and requirements for associates. We have now implemented a specific dollar threshold for contributions that must be pre-cleared and approved versus contributions that must only be reported. The below is the new policy for political contributions. Pre-clearance and approval by the Compliance Department through SCT is required for any political contributions that result in an aggregate contribution of either $350 or more per election to an elected official or candidate for whom the supervised person is entitled to vote, or $150 or more per election to an elected official or candidate for whom the supervised person is not entitled to vote. All other political contributions that fall below this threshold need only to be reported to the Compliance Department. And that'll wrap up the different reporting requirements in Schwab Compliance Technologies. Hey Alicia, can you please stress the importance of timely and accurate reporting for all associates in SCT?
Yes, thanks Amanda. Completing any initial and quarterly questionnaires in SCT is incredibly important. We appreciate all of your cooperation from associates to close out these cases in a timely manner. In fact, here is how our team usually celebrates each quarter when our employees have completed their attestations on time. Party on! Next, we are touching on confidentiality and reporting violations. It is our fiduciary duties to secure and keep information confidential. We need to ensure that the firm's proprietary information, third-party proprietary information, personal information, and client information is all kept safe and secure. How can we do this? We can do this by keeping our desks at the office and at home clean, making sure that you are locking your computer to prevent unauthorized access, also not sharing information even within the firm unless it's on a need-to-know basis. Our Code of Ethics provides more instructions on confidential information, which brings me to violations of the code. If you know an associate is violating any aspect of the code, it must be reported. There are several ways to report violations: through your team leader, the compliance department, the ELT, a member of the board, or even through the whistleblower reporting form on Schwab Compliance Technologies. This is a confidential form and will be followed up appropriately. To note, we also have an anti-retaliation policy in place to protect those who have confidentially reported violations to any of the outlets that I previously mentioned. Back to you, Jake.
Thanks, Alicia. That now wraps up part 1 of our training session and brings us to our first pit stop. So please take a break, use the restroom, grab some caffeine, and we'll see you on part 2.
All right. Part 2 of the road trip. We just had our pit stop. We've now got lots of fuel and snacks and caffeine for the second leg of the road trip here. And for this part, I'm driving in the car with my great colleagues, Sal Papa and Jeff York. We picked up Sal in New York, and now we're kind of in the middle of nowhere here on this cross-country road trip and find ourselves in the need of something to help pass the time. Sal, any ideas here to help?
Jake, really good question. This trip is getting really long, and sometimes I think actually when I'm in a long road trip with my kids, we play a game called I Spy. I mean, what better game to play with 3 compliance professionals in a car on a road trip, right? Other than I Spy.
I think that's a great idea, and I think we'll put our own twist to it. Instead of looking out the window and trying to see, a landmark or a road sign, we're going to identify compliance risk. I can think of, nothing else that would be better to pass the time for 3 compliance guys than to spy some compliance risk. So with that, we'll jump in and see where we go from here.
I'm excited.
So Sal, I'm going to come to you first with our first risk area. So I spy an activity or an action in which an advisor's interests compete with the interest of our clients. Any ideas, Sal?
Oh, that's a good question. Can I have another hint, Jake?
Sure,
I think I have an idea. Give me another hint.
So another hint here could be a type of scenario where a person or the firm may have an incentive to serve their interest at the expense of or another interest or an obligation. Any ideas?
If I got this one wrong, I'd be in big trouble. I spy conflict of interest, Jake.
That is correct. And so
Cool.
Now that we've identified the conflict and what the topic is, why don't you outline some of the ways in which we try to solve for or mitigate conflict?
For sure. Well, certainly at the end of the day, right, it's all about conflicts of interest. And I kind of view us and our team as detectives in this area, right? Trying to uncover conflicts of interest wherever they may lie. But we also rely on all of you and your disclosure of conflicts, your reporting of conflicts, and so to allow us and ensure for us to identify those conflicts of interest. And it's common that a conflict can arise anytime there's any sort of duty of care or duty of trust or duty of loyalty between 2 parties. And we're constantly reminded through SEC enforcement actions, SEC speeches, disclosures, and through the courts that an advisor's duty of loyalty includes the requirement that we disclose all material facts relating to our conflicts of interest. And this disclosure is a really key element to our fiduciary obligations, and it's really designed to enable a informed consent, if you will, from the client to that actual conflict of interest. So the theme here is we want to make sure that you're reporting any conflicts of interest, that we're disclosing any conflicts of interest, that we're adopting policies and procedures to address any conflicts of interest. And actually, where possible, we try to actually eliminate conflicts of interest, of which you'll see throughout the structure of our business. We look to eliminate many conflicts of interest that may occur at any investment advisor. And we want you to think about this as the problem of competing duties and sometimes described as the problem of wearing 2 hats, where either the firm or your self-interest is competing, right, with the client's interest. And of course, self-interest is always one element of a conflict. So be aware and identify conflicts of interest. Always want to follow the money. Look at situations where the firm versus the client conflicts, where your personal interest conflicts with a client, or where perhaps even 2 clients' interests perhaps compete and or where your personal interest may compete with the firm's personal interest as well. So that's the theme of conflicts of interest and that type of thing. So Jake, let's go to another challenge for iSpy.
Sure. So I'm going to stay on you, Sal, because again, you hit the nail on the head with conflicts of interest. So the next risk here, as defined, would be holding directly or indirectly client funds or securities, or having any authority to obtain possession of those securities. What do you think here?
Oh, Jake, this one's easy. This one's iSpy custody.
You hit it spot on. And now that we've defined it, right, what about some examples, or how do we mitigate custody?
So custody, as sort of shared there, right, is more than just physical custody, right? And we want to view custody in that broader sort of spectrum. And those examples can be trustee relationships. Those examples can be possession of client usernames and passwords. And that could even be something where there's bill paying authority. So we've given a number of common examples, and again, an area in which we rely on everyone in the organization to report these types of circumstances and situations. And of course, custody is primarily one of the larger risk areas for an investment advisor because of this access to funds or securities. And so we really rely heavily to have everybody report or identify any circumstances or situations that may trigger a custody issue. We, of course, also adopt multiple policies and procedures around this area of custody. And we also forensically test and review different areas of the organization, not only our team, but our colleagues and friends in the finance and accounting team, as well as client service, and a number of other areas. We test for situations that may be a red flag to identify an area of custody. And then, of course, we identify this area and issue for everybody on at least an annual basis, but also hopefully on an ongoing basis, because it is an area of risk that we need to fully address. So that's the general gist of custody. And let's go on to another iSpy area, Jake.
Yeah, it wouldn't be a true road trip without talking about custody, right? I can think of
absolutely.
Exciting. Yeah. So let's go to Mr. York next. Jeff, we're gonna go next to you. So iSpy, a practice of buying or selling a security in breach of some type of fiduciary duty or other relationship of trust and confidence on the basis of material, non-public information about that security. Any ideas, Jeff?
Let me see. The thing, I think I've got it. The giveaway for me is that non-public information and using that. Like, that's kind of a dead giveaway for insider trading.
You got it. So another part of insider trading is tipping. Can you talk about that, Jeff?
Sure. So everybody kind of knows kind of the general insider trading, right? At least over the years, we've given enough training, hopefully most folks do, where you're taking information you've learned and you're making trades on it, benefiting yourself, information that's not public that you're executing trades on. But tipping is a little more of a nuance there, where it's really if you take that information you've learned from the job and given it to a friend or a family member or a child and had them make the trades. Similarly, that's also insider trading. Just because you're not doing the trades yourself, the act of communicating that information to others who then use it is just as bad and is just as against the rules and as illegal as you doing it yourself. So in both cases, they're kind of two different parts of insider trading that are equally important to understand.
And how do we try to solve for that, either by way of, more training, or how do we think about mitigating the risk as best as we can of insider trading, Jeff?
Well, similar to kind of what Sal was talking about with conflicts of interest in custody, we rely on every employee of the firm to be kind of the first line of defense when it comes to insider trading. We look at things on the front lines and then kind of, behind the scenes to try to make sure that the firm doesn't have a problem and hopefully employees understand what the rules are. So, we think of things like we have the code of ethics, we have our policies and procedures that in both cases, spell out the rules of the road, pun intended there, for all the employees, so that they kind of know what is insider trading, what isn't, where questions should be asked. If, at the end of the day, if you're not sure, ask compliance. But code of ethics and policies and procedures are a good starting point, and we lay out the rules that way. There's also, trade reporting. One of the things that compliance does in the backside is all of you all know that have accounts, is it will monitor trades being done by employees. We'll monitor, certain insider information that compliance may know exists within the firm, and cross-check that off of what the trading is to just make sure no trading is being done on that. Then there's also just general kind of training. This process as part of the road trip is important. There's also focused training that we'll do on all sorts of subjects, including this. Again, hopefully getting enough information out so all the employees understand what insider trading is and the ramifications of participating in it, and knowing to spot it if need be and report it.
Perfect. Thanks, Jeff. We're gonna stay with you on our next I Spy here, and this next one's a little interesting. So I Spy something that usually takes form in 3 stages, and the first stage would be placement. The second stage is layering, and the third stage is integration. And we've got some more details on the screen there. Any ideas what this type of risk could be here, Jeff?
That one's a tough one because it's not as clear. Your clues are not as clear as I would have liked them to be. It's almost like
I'm playing the game, so you've got to come up with an answer.
Yeah, it's almost like you're trying to hide something through this process. And, I think something to do with money, clearly, because you talk about it in some of the placement piece.
You're getting warmer.
And the bank accounts. And, we have talked about something like this before. So maybe we're talking about some sort of money washing, money hiding, money laundering, something like that.
I was going to give it to you even with money washing, but yes, money laundering is the risk area we're going to talk about next. And so we've talked about the 3 stages of how money laundering happens, right? Money entering the system, someone trying to transfer the accounts and layer that money and then integrate it via legitimate assets. So that's what money laundering is, right? How do we solve for it, or how do we prevent for it, Jeff?
So a couple of things. So similar to what we've kind of continued to talk about is there is the key of training, key of policies and procedures. Without those, that would make this much harder to be able to prevent. So, we've got client procedures that, we routinely will talk to associates about. We will kind of walk through. There are both written and unwritten rules on that. Things such as you have to make sure you're identifying who the client is and make sure you've got proof of that. Just somebody calling up to just say, hey, I'm so-and-so isn't enough. There's, on that pace, there's a due diligence piece. Like, we expect our associates to not just take the word for it of the client, right? But to actually do some due diligence, whether that be driver's license, whether that be, other key information that only the client would know. We'll get in, we've talked about it very different ways over time. And then there's an OFAC screening that we do more behind the scenes, that is just looking at those employees to see whether they're on any governmental lists that have previously laundered money or they're concerned about. And again, the big piece there on the front end is the easiest way to stop money laundering is to know who the people are that are sending money. Because if you have a good sense of that, it's less likely than, the layering and the integration are going to become issues. Additionally, the looking for suspicious activity, like these kind of things come up where things just don't feel right from a gut. They just don't feel right. For example, all of a sudden you have a client who's opening up 10 different bank accounts all over the country and different bank accounts in different countries. That's like the clear giveaway of like, wait a minute, this isn't this doesn't make sense. Or they're constantly wiring money back and forth all over the place. Those are just kind of suspicious activities that, like a lot of this with compliance, if it doesn't feel right, then report it up to your manager and to your compliance, because we would rather see that it's not a problem than have the associate assume it's not, and then it wind up being a problem.
I think that's a great point, Jeff, in that, commonly for our business, right, the identification of a red flag in the money laundering area actually is identifying a problem for a different issue, not because of money laundering. So identity theft, for example, those types of things, some type of activity that's an anomaly within a customer or client's account can be identified as, oh, this is a red flag for money laundering, but as a matter of fact, isn't money laundering, but is identity theft. So I think that's a great point to reporting or being on the lookout for those red flags. Speaking of laundering, I mean, I'm in the back seat here and I'm uncovering all kinds of things in the back seat here, Jake. So I think you're laundering a number of things, including, change and some crumbs.
Yeah, did you find my dirty socks back there? I was looking for those gym socks I had. Could you, throw those up to the front seat for me?
There may even be, Sal, if you look, you may find a whole set of basketball jerseys back there.
I know. I know. It's amazing. So, Jake, let's pivot and give you a little bit of a challenge for the I Spy game. I'm loving this game, and actually, I think honestly, like the potential popularity of a compliance I Spy game, I think potentially we should be creating a version to sell.
We can maybe
I don't know about you guys.
For holiday season.
Totally. I think it could be a big hit. Totally. So, for anybody who's listening, we are trademarking and copywriting compliance I Spy, so that shouldn't be in question. So a challenge for you, Jake, here. Ready?
Sure.
Here's a hint. A decline in a person's ability to manage money and financial assets to serve his or her best interest, including the inability to understand the consequences of investment decisions. That's a loaded one, Jake.
That is. And I think I've got what you're trying to describe, but maybe give me one more clue just so I know for sure.
All right. So how about this? A decline in one's skills or the ability to make sound decisions.
Could it be diminished capacity?
You got it. One of the areas in which you've been very focused on, Jake. Well done.
Thanks. Yeah, for sure, Sal. And so when we think about the risk that is diminished capacity, and again, we've got some items outlined on the screen here for warning signs, right? Things for our advisors and our team members to keep in mind when they're working with clients. Everything from a client exhibiting signs of forgetfulness, the inability to process simple concepts, misremembering or not recalling things that might have came up during a client meeting. One big one we see is just concerns about missing funds in the account. They'll call up and think that someone has, transferred funds or they've lost all their money. And so what I've learned sort of in the research with diminished capacity in that it's oftentimes not these explicit and clear signs that pop up immediately in most cases. It's actually more of a gradual decline. When we think about the US population, right, one of the biggest sectors of our population being the baby boomers getting older. Because of that, all of the data showing more cases in Alzheimer's, more cases of diminished capacity. So again, I don't think this risk is going away in any way. And so it's important for the firm to think about, right, what controls and how do we mitigate this risk? We've got those outlined on the screen here. First is, as we mentioned, just having controls, having policies in this area to try to examine these warning signs and report possible cases is always important. And that reporting and documentation and escalation is, I think, one of the biggest things our advisors and our client service team members can do. Jeff mentioned it earlier, right? When you see something, it's always a good practice to either get others involved and or document it, whether that's in Salesforce, whether that's a follow-up email to the clients outlining, what happened during the meeting, just so we can, again, build our case that we've delivered on a full client experience and a full fiduciary duty to that client. Some other important things in this area would be education and training. Many of you have watched some of the modules we rolled out in MindFlash earlier this year on diminished capacity and elder abuse. And so again, what we're trying to do is train and get ahead and be proactive in this area so that you know some of the warning signs to look out for when and if they come up with your clients. We do have some controls with our custodian partners, right? They have also policies and procedures in this area. They, try to track account behavior and patterns. They may ask out of wallet security questions and have some additional protections from a paperwork side of things. One of which, again, and the last item here is this trusted contact form. And so that's a great solution for all of our clients for a number of reasons. But the large one is that this form gives Buckingham and our advisors the ability to contact someone sort of in the client's circle of trust that when and if a situation arises related to diminished capacity or any type of diminished mental edge, that we can reach out to that trusted contact. And that's important from a privacy side of things, that we need to have that in place before making that call. And so just to give you a lay of the landscape here, I think it's important to look at the trends. So the custodians oftentimes, are making a push or a best practice to get this done with their clients. Our FINRA registered firms on the other side of the fence are, again, there's a rule that firms make a best effort to obtain this. And so all of this momentum is leading to, likely, in my mind, the SEC making a similar rule in the next few years that, again, collecting this trusted contact form would be a best practice. And so that's kind of the approach we take on it, is that we want to get ahead of this. And so when and if possible, whether it's an RPM or the first time we're meeting with a client during onboarding, we just think it's a good practice to collect that trusted contact form, regardless of age, regardless of risk, just so we have it in place.
Thanks for your work on this area, Jake, and certainly a key area of risk for us to address, and actually is consistent with our obligations as a fiduciary, to help folks through these tough times if there's an event of diminished capacity. So let's get back to the game, Jake.
Sure, I'm going to pick on Jeff next. So I spy something red. And so we're bringing in maybe a color here that might give you a clue, Jeff. So something red where we've got some clues on the screen that could be suspicious personal information that was provided, something that was altered, forged, or reassembled, a case where a person might omit required information. Any of these clues, Jeff, ring a bell of a topic we might be thinking about?
Well, it would have been tougher, but I think the backseat driver there and Sal had alluded to some of this earlier about red flags and identity theft when we were talking about the money laundering question. So I'm going to go with identity theft.
You're spot on. So we're going to talk about regulation SID and the identity theft red flags rule. So what are some times in which this might come up, right? If I'm an associate, Jeff, when I might see, or when I might need to definitely look out for these red flags?
So I think the easiest ones, to think about are anytime an account's opening, right? Because anytime a client asks us to do something, account opening, wire transfers, money movement, certain third-party providers, basically anytime a client is asking us to do something, that's where this could come up. That's probably the easiest way to think about it. A couple examples I think you've got on your screen, but in this day and age with cyber hacks and everything else, again, anytime a client asks us to do something, could be an entryway to identity theft and fall into the reg SID rules.
Awesome. And Sal and or Jeff, feel free to jump in on some of the risk in terms of how we try to solve for it. I know we do targeted training with some of the client service teams in this area. We've got some workflows in Salesforce to hopefully trigger our teams to require them to do certain things, right? Collect certain identifications or check certain boxes to get in front of and prevent any types of identity theft. But anything else you two would point to as we think about solving or trying to solve for this risk?
Yeah, I think this is an area that is not only an issue for all of our clients, but is an issue for all of us personally as well. and our friend and colleague Jared Hoffman is a very proactive member of addressing this area, and is actually a member of the FBI's task force in this area. The partnership between both the business and law enforcement, and it's just something that we all want to stay incredibly attuned to, because this is a major issue, and there are a number of steps that we can take to not only help prevent this for our clients, or identify it actually, as a matter of fact, for our clients, but also steps you should take on a personal level as well. And I think that's, the big theme here, which is having that professional skepticism, or asking those questions, or trusting but verifying. Those are some big themes, I think, in this area, Jake.
Well, and I would just piggyback on that to say, part of the reason why there are the workflows and processes that have been recently built, have been longstanding policies that a lot of you just execute every day, but they're there for a reason, to kind of make sure that clients are protected and then we are protected. So, when executing those, know that they're not, they're there for a reason. They're not there just because, but they've been put in to try to help everybody in this process. So, that's one of the main things I think all of us can and should be focused on anytime a client asks us for something, is how are we protecting that client? And we have all these different ways that we do it, but it's ultimately to make sure that the client's protected in the way that we, take care of their money, take care of their accounts, and that sort of thing.
And oftentimes, right when we think about identity theft, I think it's important to sometimes tell stories. And I think there's no better way to pass time on a road trip than telling a story, right? And so we've got 2 case studies here of actual client events, one on the Buckingham Strategic Wealth side and one on the Buckingham Strategic Partners side, that we wanted to illustrate, that came across our desk and we dealt with, to really hammer this point home, that fraud prevention, and we've got it on the screen here, is going to be a huge sort of mission and target area for our compliance and legal team in 2021. And so I'll share the first story that on the Buckingham Strategic Wealth side, we had a case where it was a rather sophisticated attack where a client had their email hacked. And so the fraudster wisely ended up sitting in the email for a number of weeks, sort of waiting for an opportunity to strike. And so weeks before this, the actual clients had completed new paperwork to open accounts and transfer funds. About a month later, the imposter then sort of took their shot by submitting a distribution request form to send funds to, and again, air quotes here, a legitimate first-party account. The fraudster also at that time, and this is when we talk about examining trends, a big one we've seen, they've set up an auto forwarding rule within that email box to where any Buckingham correspondence between their advisor or the client service team actually went to a separate email box where the actual client was totally unaware what was happening. And so again, because the fraudster had access to the email address and prior documents during account opening, they were actually able to match the client's electronic signature on a transfer form and pass this through with a fraudulent voided check that again appeared to be titled in the client's name at a different bank. And so all of these factors, inclusive of sort of the environment we were in, right? This was during COVID. This was a work from home environment. There was, more electronic paperwork going on. Not to say that this would have been prevented otherwise, but I think that was an important factor here, in addition to sort of how we built out our controls. Rightly, I think the fraudster sort of caught on to some of the trends of verification that firms are doing, because in this case, this was a first-party transfer, again, to an account in the name of the client, where our systems didn't automatically trigger some type of other verification, whether it was getting a verbal confirmation or finding some other way to actually verify this transaction. And so all of those sort of led to, unfortunately, the fraudster submitting this money link request and actually getting substantial funds transferred to this fake bank account. And so I think it's an interesting story to tell, right, when we think about fraud prevention. And the reason we actually were made aware of this was the fraudster actually tried to dip their hand in the cookie jar again and go back a few weeks later and submitted a wire. And so again, our controls kicked in there. So we had some solid policies there that required an outbound verbal. And when we called the client for this apparent subsequent wire request, they said, hold the phone. What are you talking about? We're not familiar with any of this. And so that's really when we went into due diligence mode of figuring out what happened and trying to solve this for the client. So definitely a very real risk in a case that we saw on the Buckingham Strategic Wealth side. Sal, I know you wanted to share a story that happened with a BSP advisor, something similar to this.
For sure, Jake. Yeah, and speaking of cookie jar, can you pass those cookies back into the back seat? Because these stories make me really hungry because it gives me some anxiety.
Sure. Do you need any? I got some milk up here too. Jeff, will you pass the milk back too? Yeah.
I can, but I think Sal, if you look through the cushions of the seat, you may find some old Oreos.
Perfect. Thanks, fellas. So Jake, you know, that story, these stories are very impactful because they're real, right? And these are situations and circumstances that actually resulted in lost money, which is a really serious issue. And I'll share a story from the BSP side of things, but has some similar characteristics. And you know, before I share that story, one of the things I want to make sure to emphasize here is the verbal verification process. And we always, and I think as an industry assumed, right, when it's a first party transaction, particularly in ACH, we assume those, generally speaking, right, are not high risk areas. But fraudsters have evolved and they've started to open up fraudulently bank accounts in a client's name, and essentially it's identity theft. And the situation here that occurred with a BSP advisor is, instead of the client's email being compromised, the advisor's email happened to be compromised. So a fraudster got into an advisor's email account, began to watch and monitor all of the different activities within that email, and also started to steal information. And one of the bits of information that they stole was a account number for the custodian and custodial paperwork, as well as stole a client's identity. They then proceeded to open up they fraudulently opened up a bank account. It's a real bank account, but it happened to be fraudulently opened, and sent in paperwork to the advisor to set up a money link between that particular account and the custodial account. That paperwork was submitted to us, and we didn't have a verbal verification or other controls in place for that, and that particular account was established, or that link was established, monies were dispersed, and that money is gone. And so, you know, I think there were important lessons learned through these case studies, which are, one, verification is essential and is key, and do not take any shortcuts with that. I think the second lesson learned, which is an interesting one, which is the banking system does not have a process in place to verify the names of the customers on any first party transfers. All they do is verify the account numbers and linkages. They don't verify the identification. And so you can have accounts that are fraudulently opened either in the client's name or actually, as a matter of fact, in a different name. But as long as the account numbers match, they will establish that first party linkage. And that brings back this essential element of why verification is so key. And of course, through our BSP portal, there's going to be additional safeguards in place, because we'll know, right, when an advisor is connecting with us through there with the dual factor authentication, that we have additional controls in place there. But don't rely on email. to believe that you're not engaged with a fraudster as well. So with that, Jake, I think fraud prevention is always a top priority for us, but it's going to be one of our big focuses in 2021.
Now that we've covered some major risk areas, let's pivot next to another high priority item in cybersecurity. Alicia?
Thanks, Jake. Do you ever get that sinking gut in your feeling after you send an email, knowing that you had secure information in there but forgot to encrypt it? This is what it feels like. As a reminder, when sending confidential information via email, you can use ShareFile or you can put secure in the subject line. Next, we've been seeing some cybersecurity trends that we wanted to let you know about. One is auto-forwarding rules. An auto-forwarding rule is when an email is automatically forwarded to another email. With the help of the systems team, we have disabled this from being able to happen on all Buckingham email addresses. Next is unemployment fraud. With the rise of unemployment at the beginning of the year, many states have reported unemployment claim fraud. The majority of unemployment fraud is identity theft. And what's even scarier is that some people don't know until they receive a letter in the mail stating that they applied for unemployment. And lastly, business email compromise, which most likely happens from a phishing attempt. Which brings me to our phishing mitigation software and InfoSec training. We do have phishing mitigation software in place that tests associates on their ability to spot a phish. Including in this is InfoSec training. This was just recently released and is required for all associates to complete in a timely manner. Lastly, we wanted to update you on our disaster recovery and incident response plan. This document is now united to all sides of our business under one plan. It was updated in March of this year without even knowing that we'd have to use the plan throughout the rest of the year. With the update of the plan, we also updated team members to better align with key business leaders who would be tasked at making decisions if and when an actual disaster happens. This update was extremely helpful when we structured our COVID response team. Although 2020 has been a very difficult year all around, on a very positive note, our disaster recovery and incident response plan has been stress tested by all associates being required to work from home, in which we have successfully had little to no business interruptions. On to everyone's favorite topic, social media. As we continue to grow our online engagement through social media, we wanted to cover a few enhancements with you. Soon, each associate will be required to complete an attestation through Schwab Compliance Technologies asking which social media accounts are used for business purposes. This would include sharing a post from a Buckingham social media page. This attestation is going to kick off a series of tasks to be completed by the compliance team and you. These tasks include getting the archiving of your social media through Global Relay. This would be done via email. This allows us to ensure that associates are not pushing out content that they publish themselves without compliance approval. Additionally, this assists the compliance team with the record-keeping requirements of the firm. For the time being, Twitter and LinkedIn can be used as normal, as we can get a full archive picture of the posts that you post. Facebook is slightly different. At this time, we only allow strictly the sharing of Buckingham posts without additional comments, headers, or changes. The Buckingham posts are approved through the Compliance and Marketing SharePoint tool and can be shared, but personally developed content on Facebook is strictly prohibited. Over to you, Amanda.
I wanted to wrap things up with highlighting some specific items that the Compliance Department is particularly proud of for rolling out this year. These include the following. We took a look at the solicitor packet, which is a set of documents that outlines our program and the legal compliance requirements to use with potential solicitors. We also enhanced our diminished capacity and elder abuse training. This is a focus area of the SEC and one where we will continue to build out additional controls. The Compliance Department also made enhancements to the Schwab Compliance Technology data feeds, which were outlined earlier in this presentation, and should make personal securities reporting a whole lot easier. And lastly, we began to develop tools to help associates with divorce situations. We have some template letters and built out procedures for advisors to use in these conversations. Our compliance team is always looking for ways to help Buckingham assist our clients in the best ways possible. So please feel free to reach out if you need support in any way.
Well, that brings us to the end of this fabulous road trip. I don't know about you, but I had a lot of fun along the way, and hopefully you found it informative as well. Thank you to our legal and compliance team for their work on this project, and in particular, a special shout out goes to our creator, producer, director, Jake Fechter, for his tireless work on this creation. I also want to thank you. Thank you for the work and role that you play every day in our ethics and compliance program, because that really does protect the business. It really does enhance the brand, and it really does ensure that our reputation for integrity is protected. As Benjamin Franklin once said, it takes many good deeds to build a good reputation and only one bad one to lose it. So I want to thank you for that work that you do. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to the team. And thanks again for attending our annual compliance training.